Hi, I'm Beverly, and in this video I'm going to demonstrate how I weave a small footstool using seagrass. There are other methods of weaving these, but I only know what I know, so this is what you'll see. These are a few stools I've woven in the past. The two larger ones are actually a nesting pair of stools. The top of this double bench was woven in the same pattern we'll use in this video. Here's the stool we'll be weaving. It's a perfect size to learn the basics of seat weaving. The pattern is what chair caners call an open basket weave. So, let's get started. I learned seat weaving and caning from master caner Gwen Chapin in Arab, Alabama. She and her husband Don do some astonishing work that I could only dream of doing. They have a website where you can see some of that work. But one thing she always taught me, if you have the right tools for the job, it makes things much easier. These are some of the items you'll need to weave this stool. We'll talk about them one at a time. First, you'll need a stool, either one you have around the house or a newly purchased one. Whichever you choose, it'll need to have 4 rails to weave around. This stool came from North Carolina Basket Works and is called the Carolina Mountain Stool Frame. It's small, but it works well for beginners. Next, you'll need about 1.5 pounds of size 3 seagrass. It comes in various sizes, anywhere from 00 to number 5, and ranges from 5/64 to 1/4 inch thick. Number 3 seagrass is about 3/16 and works well for stools. A rough shuttle will help you manage your long lengths of seagrass as you warp your stool. A wooden dowel or PVC pipe to use as a spacer. It needs an outside diameter of at least 1 inch and to be long enough to span the width of your stool. I use a gardening glove to protect my hand from the rough seagrass. This is something that might be unfamiliar. Hog ring pliers and hog rings. You can use regular pliers for these rings, but this specialty tool holds the rings in place while you attach them to the weavers. It's much easier to use. We use these to add lengths to our weavers. You can't weave this stool with just one length of seagrass. The warping alone takes over 80 feet of it. So eventually you'll have to add more. There are 3 ways I know how to do this. You can either use hog rings, which are quick, easy, and hold tight, or tie a square knot, which takes up a little bit more space, or you can use waxed linen. I'll demonstrate all 3 processes. A note about the hog rings. You'll need 3/8 inch hog rings to encircle 2 strands of the number 3 seagrass. I highly recommend using stainless steel rings. Most hog rings are made of galvanized steel and will rust. If you do use galvanized rings, you can coat them with clear nail polish to help prevent that rust. You'll also need regular basket shears and various clamps and clips. Likely you already have those in your tool bag. Wood glue if you're assembling your stool. And something like these small zip ties to secure the seagrass ends to your stool rails. If you're using a stool like this one, you may need to assemble it before you get started weaving. The instructions on this stool's packaging are pretty straightforward. I'll demonstrate how to assemble it. There are 4 posts and 8 dowel rods in the package. 4 of the dowels measure 8.5 inches long. The other 4 dowels are 11.5 inches. On the legs of the stools, you'll see a series of holes. One of the sets of holes is placed higher on the leg than the other ones. We're going to take the shorter dowels and place them into the side of the legs with the higher holes. Once all 4 shorter dowels are inserted, I can put the longer dowels in the remaining holes. Assembly is that simple. However, I don't glue them as I go along. That's just in case I make a mistake, which is an easy thing to do. Having these shorter dowels sit higher than the longer ones is important. They're where we'll begin our warp. The warp is the first weaving you'll do. If you're working with a different stool and the longer dowels are on the high side, you'll want to warp on those longer sides. Otherwise, the instructions are the same. I prefer to do our warping on the shorter side to make the weaving a bit easier. Back to the assembly. With everything in the right holes, systematically remove the dowels. Squirt a little wood glue in each hole and replace the dowels. You may need a damp rag to completely wipe away any excess glue that might ooze out of these holes. If you stain the stool before weaving, stain will not penetrate that residual glue. A wet rag will dilute wood glue and wipe it away. Once glued, you'll want to ensure your stool sits flat on the floor. Who wants a rocking stool? I place something heavy, like stacks of books, on the stool while it dries overnight. After it dries, you can paint, stain, or otherwise finish the wood if you prefer. This one was just given a coat of polyurethane to seal the wood. Once the stool is prepped, you're ready to start weaving. So let's do it. To get started, we'll first need to wind your first load of seagrass onto the shuttle. This one I purchased, and it's made of 1/4-inch oak. This one we made here at home out of some scrap 3/8-inch plywood. Both work the same and hold the same amount of seagrass. A shuttle helps you manage the bulky coil of seagrass you'll be moving from one side of the stool to the other. I usually pull about 10 to 15 yards or so. You pull whatever you feel is manageable. Keep in mind, even with 15 yards, we're going to have to add to that as we go along. You'll need over 26 yards just to complete the warping. Also, you'll only use the shuttle as you're warping. There's not enough room to use it while weaving the weft, or the side-to-side passes, filling our pattern. With the shuttle wound, we are ready to start. I'm going to temporarily attach the tail of the seagrass to the longer dowel using a zip tie, but you can use a clamp if you prefer. Once we get a few rows of the weaving stabilized, you can then attach the end to an existing weaver. I'll show you how. Next, place the spacer bar across the top of the stool. This spacer creates more weaving room as you approach the end of your project. It'll stay in place throughout the warping and for about 1/3 of the weft weaving process. To be clear, the warping is the process of wrapping the seagrass back and forth in the first direction across the stool. I always start the warp on the underside of the stool, bringing it around to the top. We'll bring the warp 4 times around the dowels before we reach our next step. The term warp comes from loom weaving. The warp is the initial set of thread, yarn, or in our case, seagrass rope that becomes the foundation of the weaving pattern we are creating. In textiles, the warp is generally stiffer, stronger, and of material with a tighter twist because it has to endure the most stress in a weaving pattern. That stress becomes evident in this weave as it gets very tight by the time we finish. The spacer bar creates a little extra room in our warp to relieve some of that stress. After finishing the first grouping of 4, we'll stop as we make a pass over the top of the short dowel and tighten everything up a bit. I use a clamp to hold the seagrass tight. But before we take off warping again, we want to wrap 2 loops around the short dowel. This creates the 4x4 open basket weave pattern we're working on. After we make the wraps on one end and get to the bottom of the dowel, we then go to the other side and do the same thing, wrapping around the dowel twice. This is our first grouping of 4 warps, followed by 2 spacers. Now warp 4 more and add 2 more spacers. We'll do this across the short side of the stool, ending with a grouping of 4 at the other leg. So let's get warping. At some point, you're going to run out of seagrass and will need to reload your shuttle. Or you'll run into a bad strip of seagrass like this one that we are going to eliminate. Either way, we'll need to connect the ends of our weavers. So let's get rid of this bad section of seagrass and look at some options. First, turn the stool over because we want to always make these connections on the bottom. Make your cut in a place where you have plenty of length. One way to connect a new weaver is to tie a square knot. This is how that is done. The square knot, which is the only knot I remember from my Girl Scout days, is a simple knot. With one end in my right hand and the other in my left, I cross the one on the right over the one on the left, pass it under, and complete the tie. Then I take the one in my left hand and cross it over the one on my right and finish tying it. Pull it tight, you have a solid square knot. Another method, the one I use most often, is attaching two ends together using hog rings. It makes a quick, neat connection of your weavers. First, you'll need to load the hog ring into the pliers. If you're using spring-loaded pliers like these, they will hold the hog ring in the little indentations until you're ready to clamp it shut. The hog rings can be difficult to slip over the two strands of seagrass because the gap is so small. There's a little trick to fix that. Use pliers to widen the gap a bit. It takes a little brute strength. Another way to open them up is to hammer them down the nose of a pair of needle nose pliers. Widening the gap makes them much easier to use. That done, here's how I connect the ends. Overlap the ends by about 2 inches and then use a clip to hold them in place. Then, about a 1/2 inch from the end of one of the weavers, I slip the ring around the 2 pieces of seagrass and clamp the ring together. It's easy as pie. I do this twice, placing 2 rings about 1 inch apart. I'll show you how I do this with wax linen in a few minutes. Now, resume warping until you complete a group of 4 where the leg meets the dowel. At that point, you should have 7 groups of 4 and 6 groups of 2. I like to have an odd number of groups of 4 for the symmetry it creates. When you begin weaving, you'll want to make your first row of weaving to match your last. Not all stools let you do that, but fortunately, this one does on the short side. The longer side, however, will have 10 groups of 4 when you're done. We finish our warping process when we reach the leg, and we're almost ready to weave. Heads up, do not cut the seagrass here. We'll simply change directions and take it across the stool. But first, let's turn the stool over so we can take care of a few things. Let's go back to where we started the warp. We're going to attach the beginning tail to the nearest weaver using hog rings. We'll use the hog ring just like we connected those 2 ends together a moment ago. Once the tail is secured to the weaver, we can cut our zip tie to release it. However, because the warp absorbs a lot of the stress, we'll want to secure it twice. Another way to secure this tail is by wrapping a length of wax linen around the weavers tightly about 6 or 7 times. We'll use a square knot to secure the ends of the wax linen together. Whichever way you choose, secure the end of the seagrass tightly. Let's go back to the other side of the stool at the leg. Your warp will have ended on top of the stool. Now we'll need to unwrap the seagrass coil from the shuttle. Things are too tight to use the shuttle anymore. Next, we'll wrap the seagrass around the dowel to the underside and around the inside of the stool leg. We'll then turn the stool upright and bring the seagrass around to the top of the dowel. You're now ready to start weaving. We'll start our weave across the stool over the first group of 4, under the second 4, then over the third group of 4, and so on until you reach the other side. When you get to the other side, tighten everything up and turn the stool over. Now, you'll do the same weave pattern on the bottom. Go over 4, then under 4, then over 4, and so on. You'll notice as you start, the first group of 4 underneath only has 3 strands. That's because the first loop started in the middle of the stool. Also note, you'll always wrap your weaver around the outside of the rails. Once you reach the other side, flip the stool over, tighten the seagrass, and begin pass number 2 across the top. This one should be easier. The first pass in every group of 4 is the toughest of the group. Each subsequent weaver in the group follows the path of the first. You'll make 4 passes, creating a group of 4 on top of the stool, but this weaver is not going to be long enough to finish the group. We're going to need to add new length of seagrass. I'll clip this to the side as I explain this technique. I want to add the new seagrass in a place on the bottom of the stool that goes under a group of 4. That will help hide my joint. That means I need to pull everything tight. Then I determine where it will pass under the group of 4, take my hog ring and clamp it on right there. Again, you'll need to secure the ends with 2 hog rings to be safe, and make sure they're clamped tight. Then you can clip off the excess of the old weaver. Make sure you clip the shorter end. Ask me why. I know. I have made that mistake many times. Now we can take off weaving again. We have one more pass to make it across the top. Just like when warping, when you get 4 across the top, wrap the seagrass around the dowel twice to create the space between the groups. You may notice the addition I made to my weaver was a much shorter length than the amount I added while warping. That's because the weaving requires lots of pulling. The longer the weaver's length, the more you have to pull through the seagrass as you weave. Turn the stool over and we'll weave the 4th weaver of the group across the bottom. I want to show you something here that will make more sense later. Let's clamp the weaver to the dowel first. Now take the weaver through and stop. See this gap right through here? It's just like the similar gap that we made while we were warping. Those gaps are correct. They may not look right and they can be confusing, but they are a correct attribute of this pattern. We just want to make sure this only happens on the bottom. Now, flip the stool over, wrap the seagrass twice around the dowel, and we'll start the second group of 4 on the top. This time, the group of 4 will be woven just opposite the previous group of 4. Start weaving under 4, then over 4, then under 4. This is just like the process we've been using. Just follow the pattern. Complete the group of 4, wrap 2 for space, weave a group of 4, then wrap 2. No doubt you get the picture. The same thing on the bottom. We start a new group under the first group of 4, over the next, and so on. This is generally when I put a gardening glove on my pulling hand. The glove is a bit awkward, but your hand will thank you in the long run. The pulling is about to become more difficult as things tighten. We'll weave until we have 10 groups of 4 and 9 groups of 2. Even on this one, we'll need to keep things tight to fit 10 groups of 4. We have 4 groups of 4, and about now, you're likely noticing a few things. 1, the weaving is getting tighter. We're going to remove the dowel to give us a little more weaving room. 2nd, the tightness is causing a problem. As it's coming through the warp, friction on the seagrass weaver is not allowing it to twist in its natural direction. What I do to counteract that is, as I weave and pull it through, I twist it away from me to counteract the behavior. Clamp down the seagrass and remove the dowel. You can see there's a good deal of play in the warp, but that relief will be short-lived. I'm cutting my weavers about 5 yards long and getting at least 2 groups of 4 from each weaver. You can make these weavers longer, but as I said earlier, it means you're going to do a lot more pulling. Another pointer I'll throw in here is to take the weaver and double it before weaving through the warp. Use the loop to pull it through. That also helps control the twisting seagrass. When we flip the stool over, on the bottom you'll see the last weaver of each group of 4 is separate from the other 3. Again, that is as it should be. As I resume weaving, you can see why I use a glove. The abrasive seagrass can really chew up your skin in a hurry. We got a ways to go before we get our 10 groups of 4. Keep packing your weavers tight to give yourself room for all 10 groups. And even when you're keeping things tight, by group 8, you'll likely see that there's not enough room to get all the weaving in there. Don't give up, it will fit. Here's how you can squeeze that weaving together a bit tighter. Using your fingers may not yield enough room. Another way to gain some extra space is to use a hammer and screwdriver to pack your weaving. Turn the stool on its side. Insert the screwdriver between the rows toward the bottom and gently tap the screwdriver's shaft. You can see your weaving will slip downward just a little, giving you more room. Work your way up your weaving, going from side to side. After about 3 rows, turn your stool around and pack the underside. As you weave, the weaver becomes more and more difficult to maneuver through your warp. On the underside, bring that errant member of our group of 4 over to its proper group. The twists and kinks will become more pronounced. Remember to twist it away from you to counteract that. Here's another trick. As it becomes more difficult to get your finger into the weaving, take a packing tool with a bent shaft and use it as a hook to grab your weaver as it goes under the group of 4. It can make it easier to grab the loop and pull it up. The packer also acts as a handle to pull the weaver through the gap. Another hint, by pulling only on the long end of that loop, it eliminates a lot of the twists and kinking. The technique works on both the top and the bottom. Once you've completed all 10 of our groups of 4 on the top and bottom, tie off the weaver on the underside of the stool. We'll do it just like we did on the beginning tail. You can either tie it with wax linen or you can use a hog ring to attach the end to an adjoining weaver. I'm going to trim my weaver so I can hide its end under this group of 4. By raising the tail and the adjacent weaver just a bit, I can slip my hog ring around them, securing the tail easily. There's very little pressure on this end, so we'll only clamp it with 1 hog ring. Slip the tail underneath the group of 4, turn your stool over, and voila! Your stool is complete and ready for use. I will caution you, don't let an adult use this as a step stool. This stool is more for decoration, to be used as a footstool, or for a child. But it is a good starter stool to begin to learn the art of chair weaving. As always, if you have any questions or would like a copy of the pattern and graphics, including all the information contained in this video, just send me an email at the address on the screen and I'll be glad to share it with you. I appreciate you giving me a few minutes to share this information with you. And feel free to share pictures of your handiwork with me. I enjoy seeing and learning from others. We do these videos simply because we enjoy sharing. Hopefully, this gives you the encouragement to branch out and try other chair caning projects.